The morning she chose to say nothing was the morning everyone in the county began to watch her. She had not meant it as a strategy. She had meant it as survival, the way a woman learns to keep still when the ice beneath her is uncertain, not because stillness saves her, but because movement guarantees the fall. Cecily Vane had been practicing this particular stillness for 11 months, which was the length of her marriage to Edmund Ashford, Duke of Ravenscroft, and she had become very good at it. Good enough that when she walked into the nave of St. Cuthbert's that Sunday in August and saw Isabeau Renard seated 3 pews from the front in a gown of Ashford blue, with the Ducal crest embroidered at the collar, the silver heron on the black field that Cecily herself wore only at state occasions, she did not stop walking. She did not turn her head. She found her own pew, settled her skirts, opened her prayer book to the correct page, and smiled at the altar with the serene inattention of a woman whose thoughts were entirely elsewhere. She did not know then what that smile would cost her. Had she known, she believes now, she would have worn it all the same. The church was full. St. Cuthbert's was always full when Cecily attended, because the county had decided within a fortnight of the wedding that the Duchess of Ravenscroft was the most interesting woman it had acquired in a generation, and interesting women must be observed carefully in case they do something definitive. They were still waiting. 11 months of waiting, and still she had given them nothing. No tears at dinner parties, no sharp words in the milliner's, no letters sent to her father's house that anyone had managed to intercept. She kept the ducal accounts in a hand so precise the solicitors had stopped sending corrections. She managed the 3 estates, the London house, and the charity school at Ardcourt with the same composed efficiency, and she never, in any company, mentioned the Duke's arrangements. The Reverend Mr. Poole began the service. Cecily read the responses in a clear, measured voice. In the pew to her left, her lady's companion, Mrs. Agnes Holt, 71 years of age, 4 feet 11 inches of organized opinion, and the only person in the county who spoke to Cecily without any secondary calculation, leaned close enough that the ostrich feather in her bonnet brushed Cecily's cheek. "She is wearing the crest," Agnes said, under the first hymn. "I see that. The actual crest, not an approximation. I see that also." "Do you require smelling salts?" "I require," Cecily said, still reading the hymnal, "for you to sing the descant, Agnes, because you are the only person in this building who knows it." Agnes sang the descant. But her eyes did not leave the back of Isabeau Renard's elaborate coiffure for the remainder of the service, and when they filed out into the August heat afterward, it was Agnes who managed. With the absolute precision of a woman who has spent 7 decades placing herself exactly where she intends to be, to ensure that Cecily emerged into the churchyard at the same moment as the Duke of Ravenscroft himself. He was standing at the Lich Gate with 2 of his friends, Miss Doyle and Sir Francis Pemberton, and he had the look he always had in her presence, not guilty, which would have been easier, but guarded. Edmund Ashford was a large man, broad across the shoulders in a way his tailor could only partially address, with working hands his rank made inexplicable, and eyes of a particular gray that Cecily had once, in the first fortnight of their marriage, made the mistake of finding compelling. He was 34 years old and had been a widower for 3 years before their wedding, and whatever grief that first marriage had carved into him had not healed so much as calcified into a general policy of silence. He looked at her. She looked at him. Between them, the entire congregation of St. Cuthbert's held its breath. "Your Grace," Cecily said, and walked past him toward the carriage. She heard Francis Pemberton exhale behind her. She heard Agnes, following at her shoulder, produce a sound that in another woman would have been called a snort, and in Agnes was called a considered editorial. And she heard, As she reached the carriage step and the footman handed her up, the Duke said nothing at all, which was, she had learned, his preferred response to every situation that mattered. The Michaelmas quarter day was 3 weeks distant, which meant Cecily had precisely 3 weeks before Lord Harwell arrived from London to audit the combined accounts of the Ravenscroft estates and deliver his annual recommendation to the Board of Trustees. She had been preparing for 6 weeks. The preparation had begun as all her useful work began, with something she was not supposed to know. She had found the first discrepancy in May in the Ardcourt household ledger, in a column of figures relating to the purchase of lime for the tenant cottages. The sum was not large. That was why it had worked for as long as it had. A small excess, well within what a man of any consequence might dismiss as rounding error, or a steward's reasonable latitude, except that Cecily had been managing accounts since she was 14 years old and had learned her arithmetic from a father who believed that carelessness with small numbers was the first symptom of catastrophic character failure. She had looked at the lime column for a long time. Then she had looked at the salt column, then the coal column, the lamp oil column, and the wages column for outdoor staff. None of the numbers were large, but they all moved in the same direction, and they had been moving in the same direction for a year and 7 months, and when she added them together and carried them forward, the total was not small at all. The steward of Ardcourt was a man named Simeon Price. He had held the position for 9 years, the last 2 of which coincided almost exactly with the period under question. He was 40, immaculate in his dress, and spoke in the gentle, reasonable voice of a man who has never found it necessary to raise it. He was also, Cecily had by now concluded, the most dangerous person on the estate, not because he was violent or cruel, but because he was patient and because he had understood something about this household that she suspected everyone else had missed. He had understood that no one was watching the accounts. Edmund had not watched them, not properly, since the death of his first Duchess. The solicitors watched only the London properties. The Ardcourt accounts existed in their own world, forwarded annually to London for Lord Harwell's inspection, and Lord Harwell was a man of 63 who trusted what he had always trusted, and did not look for what he had no reason to expect. Price had known all of this. He had known it, Cecily thought, the way a man knows the depth of a river before he decides to ford it. What he had not known, what none of them had known, was that the new Duchess would ask to see the accounts the week after her arrival, on the grounds that she found it difficult to manage a household she did not understand, and that this reasonable feminine request would be granted without anyone imagining she might understand what she found. She had not yet brought it forward. There was a reason for this, and the reason was not timidity. She had one piece she could not place. There was a second set of figures, a column in the London account, in a different hand from Price's, relating to payments described only as professional consultation, and until she knew whose hand it was, she did not know how far the rot had reached. She had told no one. She had told Agnes only that she was working on something that required patience, and Agnes, who had understood Cecily since she was 4 years old, had accepted this without further questions, and had taken to locking the study door herself when Cecily was within it. 3 weeks to quarter day. 3 weeks before Harwell arrived, before the accounts were formally reviewed, before whatever action Price had been building toward for a year and 7 months arrived at its intended conclusion. She did not yet know what that conclusion was. She knew only that it would be pointed at someone, and that she was a woman in a house where no one had been watching, and that women in such houses are very useful targets. The Duke came home 2 days after the Sunday of the Crest. He did not mention the incident at St. Cuthbert's. He mentioned, instead, that he had been reviewing the correspondence from the Ardcourt estate and found it all in excellent order, which she received as the first genuinely interesting thing he had said to her in some time. They were in the library. She had been working when he appeared, and she did not close what she was working on, because closing it quickly would have been more revealing than leaving it open. He glanced at the spread of papers, the deliberate ones she had left visible, the Michaelmas preparation, and then, at her face, in that measuring way he had that she had first read as arrogance and had since revised her opinion of several times, without landing anywhere definitive. "You are prepared for Harwell's visit," he said. "I am always prepared. He will have questions about the Ardcourt renovation costs. There was a shortfall in the original estimate." "I know, I have the supplementary figures," she did not say, "and 4 other sets of figures you do not know I have. Will you be present for the review?" Something shifted in the gray eyes. "I had not planned to be." "I think," Cecily said, returning to her paper, "that you should plan to be." He was quiet for a moment. She did not look up. "Is there a reason," he said, "that I should hear directly from you rather than from Harwell after the fact?" "Several, but they are not things I can lay before you at present." Another silence. She heard him cross to the window, which was not a short journey in this library. He stood there for some time. When he spoke again, his voice was different, not warmer, exactly, but less defended, as though the distance had made something permissible that proximity had not. "My wife managed the accounts before you," he said. "The first 3 years of Ardcourt, the repairs to the north wing, she had an excellent head for it." Cecily said nothing. She was aware this was a territory she had not been invited into before. She died in January. 3 years passed. He paused. "You knew that." "I knew the date. The cold wing," he said. She always went to bed in the cold wing because she said the heat in the main house gave her headaches, and I was a bad enough husband not to follow her there as often as I ought. He said it with such flat precision that it cost her something to keep her face composed. "I mention it because the accounts fell into some disorder after. I did not attend to them as I should have." Cecily looked up then. He was still at the window, his back partly to her, his hands clasped behind him, those inexplicable working man's hands with the scar along the right index finger that she had wondered about 100 times and never asked about. "I see," she said. "Thank you for telling me." He turned then and looked at her with an expression she had not yet catalogued, not the armored wariness, not the deliberate distance, but something quieter and more uncertain, as though he had expected a different response and did not know what to do with this one. He left without further conversation, but he left the door open, which he did not usually do. She took this for what it was, not an invitation, exactly, but a crack in a door that had been latched since November. She went back to the second set of figures and looked at the handwriting for a long time. Then she took a sheet of paper from her correspondence file, a letter sent to her in June about the Ardcourt drainage works, signed by Simeon Price, and set it beside the London account column. The hands were different, but she had not expected them to be the same. What she was looking at now was not the writing. She was looking at the letter spacing. The particular gap between a capital P and its following vowel, the slight leftward lean of all descenders. She knew this hand from somewhere. She had been trying to place it for 6 weeks. She placed it on a Thursday morning in September, 9 days before quarter day, in the most mundane possible way. She was reviewing the household correspondence from the previous year, looking for something else entirely, and she turned a page and found a note sent in March about the London kitchen accounts, and the hand was there. The same P, the same lean. The note was signed by Edmund's man of business, a Mr. Clarence Voss, who had managed the London account under Harwell's oversight for 11 years, and who was, as far as anyone could determine, entirely above reproach. Cecily sat with this knowledge for a full hour before she moved. She did not reach for the bell. She did not call Agnes. She sat very still, the way she had sat in St. Cuthbert's, and she considered the shape of what she now understood. Price was taking from the estate accounts. Voss was taking from the London accounts. They were doing it in different hands, in different ledgers, on a schedule that would be invisible if you looked at either set alone, and would only resolve into a pattern if you held them side by side and knew what to look for. Neither man would have been confident the other would be found. It was possible they did not even know about each other. More likely, she thought, they did, and had arranged the scheme precisely because two separate frauds were harder to prosecute than one. If discovered, each could claim ignorance of the other's portion. But there was a third possibility that she had been turning over and not quite looking at directly, that someone had arranged them both. She needed the cipher. The professional consultation payments referenced an account number she had not yet matched to any name. She needed the original correspondence, the letters that had initiated those payments, and those letters were in the London house, in a file she had never had reason to access. They would be in Edmund's correspondence room, which she did not enter. And she could not ask for them without explaining why she wanted them, and she could not explain why she wanted them without showing her hand before she was ready. She sat with this for another hour. Then she did what she had been training herself not to do for 11 months. She decided she needed help. She found him in the stable yard, of all places, which was where he went when he was thinking, and which she had known for some time but never commented on. He was examining the near foreleg of a hunter with an attention she recognized from watching him in the library, the same quality of concentration applied to a different problem. He did not hear her approach. She stopped at the gate and watched him for a moment, which was the first time she had allowed herself this, and felt something shift in her chest that she chose not to examine. "The left foreleg," she said. "He has been favoring it since July." He looked up, startled, and then collected himself. "You notice horses. I notice most things. She came through the gate. My father bred hunters. I grew up knowing which signs to watch for." He stepped aside, not by much, but enough to make the gesture legible, and she moved to the horse's head, speaking low, and ran her hand down the leg from knee to pastern with a practiced pressure. The hunter turned his head to regard her with the measured contempt of an animal deciding whether to approve. "There," she said, at the fetlock. A small thickening, not serious yet, rest him and cold pack it for a fortnight. The silence that followed was of a different quality than the usual ones. She was aware of him watching her with the horse the way he had watched her in the library the week before, cataloging, revising. "My wife was afraid of horses," he said. She had not expected him to say it again. She waited, not afraid exactly. Careful, she did not trust them. He took the horse's bridle from the groom who had materialized nearby, ran a hand along the animal's neck with the ease of long practice. "You do not seem to find them uncertain. They tell you what they mean. Most creatures do, if you watch carefully enough." She looked at him then, directly, which she also did not usually do. "I need something from you." Both his brows rose, very slightly. "I need access to the London correspondence files, the room off your study. I need the files from January of last year through April of this year, relating to accounts managed by Mr. Voss." He was very still. That was how she knew it had landed. "You are asking me," he said slowly, "for access to my private correspondence. I am asking for the account files, not your letters." "There is a distinction. Why?" because I believe there is something in them that Harwell's review will miss if we do not find it first, and I cannot explain the full reasoning until I have verified what I suspect." She held his eyes. "I am not asking you to trust me without grounds. I am asking you to give me access in exchange for a full accounting before Harwell arrives of everything I have found and what it means. I have been working on this for 4 months. I need one thing I cannot get without your help." The horse moved, and he steadied it with one hand without looking away from her. "4 months," he said. "Since May, and you have told no one. Agnes knows I am working on something. She does not know what." He studied her face for what felt like a very long time, with the focused intensity he brought to the horse's leg and the library and nothing else, and she held very still under it, because she had said all she had to say, and anything more would be retreat. "The files from January through April," he said at last, "in my study, under my supervision, this afternoon." She did not let herself breathe visibly. "Thank you." He turned to hand the horse back to the groom. Then, so quietly she was not certain she had heard correctly, "I should have asked these questions 6 months ago." She was not sure if he meant the files, or the accounts, or something else. She thought, walking back across the stable yard, that perhaps it did not matter. He had said it. It was the first unguarded thing he had said to her, and it was in the form of a self-indictment, which was not what she would have expected from him, and which told her something she filed away carefully under a heading she did not name, even to herself. The files from January through April were in 3 boxes organized by month, which suggested that someone had taken some care with them. Edmund sat at the far end of the long study table and worked through his own correspondence while she worked through the boxes, and neither of them spoke for 2 hours, which was by some distance the most comfortable 2 hours she had spent in this house. She found it in the February box, in a letter she almost passed over, because it appeared to be a routine notation about account transfers. The notation referenced a personal account number, and beside the account number, in a hand she now recognized immediately, was a name. Not Voss. The account was a personal account, private, held outside the estate structure. And the name beside it was Isabeau Renard. She sat with this for a moment. Then she understood the shape of the whole thing, and it was both more and less than she had expected. Isabeau Renard was not simply receiving, she was directing. The professional consultation payments were going to her account, which meant that someone, Voss or Price, or both, was funneling estate funds through a chain that ended with the Duke's Mistress, and the arrangement was designed so that if it were ever discovered, the paper trail would lead directly to the Duchess's investigation, and look, to anyone examining it quickly, as though the wife had been constructing evidence against the mistress out of personal grievance. It was very good. She had to admit it was very good. "I have what I need," she said. He looked up from his own work. She turned the February notation toward him across the table. She watched his face as he read it, and what she saw there was not what she had anticipated. She had anticipated anger or calculation or the controlled blankness he deployed in company. What she saw instead was something older and quieter, a man recognizing a shape he had been living inside without knowing it. He set the paper down. He did not look at her. "How long have you known her name was in these accounts?" "I did not know until this moment. I knew an outside account was receiving funds. I did not know whose. This will appear," he said, in a voice like gravel smoothed flat, as though you manufactured it. "A wife, constructing a case against. I know what it will appear as. That is why I need you in the room when Harwell arrives. Not to vouch for me. To understand what you are looking at before anyone tells you what to think." He was quiet for a very long time. Outside the study window, a wood pigeon was conducting its self-important business in the cedar tree, entirely unbothered by the reconfiguration of the Ravenscroft household occurring 3 feet away. Cecily watched it and waited. "There is something else," he said. "Isn't there?" "Yes, the something you said you could not yet lay before me." "Yes." He looked at her then, and she thought, this is the moment. The door in the latch, or closed again for good. "I am asking you to trust me," she said. "I know I have given you very little reason to, and I am not asking you to feel the trust, only to act on it long enough for me to prove the ground is solid. If I am wrong, you may say so publicly, and I will not dispute it. If I am right," she stopped, and chose the next words with care. "If I am right, we will need to decide together what to do with it." She had said we. She heard herself say it. She did not take it back. He stood up and went to the window and stood with his back to her again in that way he had. The pigeon departed. The cedar stood empty in the afternoon light. "You will have the full accounting before Harwell arrives," he said at last. "On one condition." She waited. "You do not conduct this alone. Whatever you are planning for the review, whatever the ground turns out to be, I am in the room." It was not the condition she had expected. She had expected a demand for more information, or a qualification, or a negotiation. He was offering to stand in it with her, and the offer was so direct that she had to look away for a moment, at the boxes of files, at her own careful notations in the margin of the February letter, while she put her face back into order. "Those terms," she said, "are entirely acceptable." She heard, very quietly, something that might have been the beginning of a breath that had been held since January 3 years past. She filed that also, under the heading she was still not naming, and began to organize what she would need for the review. The blow arrived 4 days before quarter day, from a direction she should have anticipated, and did not. She came back from the Ardcourt Cottage visits. She made them every second week, with the physician's report and the estate medicine chest, because no one else had been doing it, and because she had found that talking to tenants in their own kitchens was the fastest education available on what was actually happening on an estate. To find Agnes waiting in the hall with her face arranged in the expression that meant something had happened, and Agnes had decided Cecily needed 30 seconds of ignorance before she learned it. "Price has been to see Mr. Doyle," Agnes said. "This morning. While you were at the cottages. Mr. Doyle, Edmund's oldest friend, his confidant since school, his channel of communication for every piece of sensitive information he did not wish to commit to paper." Cecily stood in the hall and felt the floor settle under her feet in a new configuration. "What did he bring him?" "A letter, apparently. I do not know the contents." But Doyle went directly from the meeting to the London road. Agnes paused. He took his horse, not the carriage. He was moving quickly. A letter. Price had gone to Doyle, not to Harwell, which meant the letter was not about accounts. Accounts you bring to auditors. Letters you bring to friends who have the ear of the principal. What did Price have to say to Edmund that he could not put in a formal complaint, that he needed routed through a confidant? She knew by the time she reached the library. She had known since she turned the question over twice on the way up the stairs. Price had found out she was investigating him, or rather, he had found out she had accessed the London files. And he had moved first. He had constructed a story for Doyle, for Edmund, through Doyle, in which the Duchess's investigation of the accounts was not a forensic exercise, but a domestic one. A wife, scorned, using her unusual access to the accounts to build a case against the woman the Duke preferred. A manipulation of evidence. A scheme dressed as housekeeping. He had just turned her 4 months of work into proof of a motive. She sat down at the library desk and looked at her notes, and she was cold with a specific, functional fear, not the fear of being hurt, but the fear of being disbelieved. They were different, and the second was worse. Edmund returned the following afternoon. She heard the horse in the yard and heard him come through the hall, and then the study door, and then nothing for a long time. She went to the library and sat and did not go to him, because whatever Doyle had told him needed to settle, and intruding on the settling was a mistake she did not intend to make. He came to find her at 8 o'clock, which was dinner time, and they sat at opposite ends of the dining table in the usual way, and she waited. Doyle came to London, he said, when the footman had withdrawn. I know. He brought me a letter from Price. I know. He looked at her down the length of the table, and she thought, here is where 11 months and a stable yard and a study afternoon and a we either amount to something or they do not. Price says, Edmund said carefully, that you have been conducting a personal investigation, that the access you requested was not related to the estate accounts, but to your own domestic concerns, that the files you examined were chosen. Yes, he would say that. Is it true? She held his gaze across the table, across the silver and the candles and the distance that was only partly physical. No, he looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, not decision exactly, but the approach of decision. I need you to show me, he said, what you found. All of it. Tonight, she showed him. Every column, every notation, every convergent figure, the lime and the salt and the coal and the lamp oil, the London professional consultation payments in Voss's hand, the February notation with the private account number, the name beside it, and then the piece she had been holding back, the piece she had not known quite how to use, the original letter from January of the previous year, found at the bottom of the January box on her second pass through the files, in which Voss wrote to someone unnamed, at an address that was a London hotel, about the arrangement they had discussed and confirming the account details. The letter was addressed, My Dear Isabeau. Edmund read it twice. He set it down. He picked it up and read it a third time. She waited. She organized it, he said. Yes, she used Price and Voss as the instruments and arranged it so that if it were found, it pointed at you. At a grieved wife constructing evidence. Yes, he was quiet for a long time, looking at the letter. The candles were burning low. She had lost track of the time. I am going to ask you something, he said, without looking up, and I want you to answer it plainly. I always answer things plainly. The beginning of something crossed his face that she was not accustomed to seeing there. I know. He set the letter down. Did you find this because you suspected her specifically, or did you find it in the ordinary course of the accounts? In the ordinary course. I did not know whose name I was looking for until I found it. He nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when he has asked a question whose answer determines something important and has received the answer that requires him to act. Then we will end it, he said. Before Harwell arrives. With witnesses. She did not let herself lean back in her chair. She held still and said, I believe the objects themselves need to speak. Not us. Harwell needs to see it in the light, with the right people in the room, before anyone has been able to tell him a competing story. Doyle, Edmund said. Doyle has already heard Price's version. You will need to invite him back. And Lady Farnsworth, she is Harwell's oldest acquaintance and sits on the Ardcourt Charitable Trust. Her word, if she witnesses the demonstration, cannot be discounted, and Price himself. Price in the room is essential. The hinge, she said, thinking of the one piece she had not yet solved, the one witness she needed to crack before the whole thing would resolve. Is Voss. Voss is in London. Can you bring him without alerting him? He had stood up, and he was looking at her across the table with that expression she had, still not quite catalogued, but it was closer now, it was less mysterious, it had a direction. I will tell him it is a routine account query before the quarter day. He has no reason to refuse. Bring him the evening before Harwell. And do not tell Price he is coming. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you have been planning this for some time. I have been hoping I would not need to. But you prepared for it, in case. I always prepare. He looked at her across the ruins of the dinner neither of them had eaten, the silver and the candles and the spread of papers between them, and said very quietly, I know. She went to bed with the sense of the ground becoming more solid underfoot, and lay awake for an hour afterward thinking about how quickly things can become certain when you stop being careful and simply move. The night before Harwell arrived, it rained. An end of September rain, decisive and purposeful, the kind that seemed to close a door on the long summer that had pressed like a hand on everything since August. Cecily listened to it on the window glass and thought, this is right. The weather was closing the summer down, and in the morning they would go into the library with the papers and the people and the light, and whatever came out the other side of it would have to be faced, and she was not, on the whole, afraid. Edmund had brought Voss from London without incident. Voss was a neat man of 52, with precise gestures and a meticulous manner. And when he arrived he had greeted Cecily with a courtesy so careful, it told her immediately that he had guessed something. Not everything, but enough to be afraid. She watched his hands at dinner. They were very still. Still hands on a frightened man are the sign of someone who has decided to control his way out of a situation, and she noted it and made no further indication that she had. Price arrived the morning of the review, at Edmund's invitation, on the stated grounds that his presence would be necessary to speak to the Ardcourt figures. He came in his most immaculate coat, with the gentle voice precisely calibrated, and greeted Cecily with a solicitude so perfect it was a kind of art. She replied with equal perfection and watched Agnes, in the corner of the entrance hall, observe him with the expression she reserved for things that needed stepping on. Lord Harwell arrived at 10. He was everything she had expected, 63, authoritative, comfortable in the assumption that he would find what he expected to find, and the kind of man who could be moved by evidence if it was placed in front of him correctly, and not at all by argument. She had designed the morning around this. Lady Farnsworth arrived with him, as prearranged. Edmund had invited her specifically, and she had come with the brisk curiosity of a woman who has managed large charitable interests for 30 years and has learned to follow interesting invitations. They assembled in the library, Harwell and Lady Farnsworth on one side of the table, Price to the left with the deliberate openness of a man who has nothing to hide, Voss to the right trying to make himself peripheral, Doyle standing near the window with an expression of guarded readiness, Agnes beside the door, and Edmund at the head of the table. Cecily stood, by her own preference, slightly to the side, near the shelves where the boxes were organized and labeled. Your Grace has asked for this review to proceed with some additions to the usual format, Harwell said. I am happy to accommodate, though I confess I am not certain what I am looking for. You are looking, Edmund said, at the same accounts you have reviewed for 9 years. Her Grace will walk you through what they reveal when they are examined together, rather than separately. Harwell looked at Cecily with the benign tolerance of a man who finds this slightly unusual, but is willing to indulge a young duchess's interest. She accepted the look without expression and laid the first paper on the table. She did not make a speech. That was not how it would land. She walked Harwell through the figures in the same order she had found them, column by column, and she used simple arithmetic and direct language, and she paused wherever she wanted him to see the pattern before she named it. He leaned forward over the Ardcourt figures. He looked at the London figures. He looked at the Ardcourt figures again. These figures, cross-referenced, he said slowly, produce a consistent extraction, Cecily said. Over 19 months. In sums small enough individually to fall below any single review threshold, but totaling, she turned a page and set it before him. The room was very quiet. She could hear the rain, which had slowed but not stopped. Price moved first. Your Grace, the voice was perfect, measured concern, the merest hint of pained regret. I am afraid I must observe that these papers have been assembled by a party with a personal interest in the narrative they produce. The selection of which columns to examine and which to omit creates an impression that, shall we look at the letter? Cecily said. She took it from the second box, the January letter, in Voss's unmistakable hand, addressed my dear Isabeau, and she set it on the table in front of Harwell and held it to the lamplight, which was necessary because the rain had darkened the morning, and Harwell leaned over it and read it, and Lady Farnsworth leaned past him to read it with him. The silence, when they had finished, was of a different quality entirely. Mr. Voss, Harwell said, in the voice of a man who has spent 40 years with documents and knows one when he sees it. This letter. Voss's hands were still on the table. She watched them. I would need to examine the original, Voss said. My recollection of that period is not. It is your hand, Cecily said. My hand may have been used. A clerk, perhaps, or Miss Voss. Harwell's voice had become something else now. The voice of a man who had trusted this arrangement for 9 years and understood what he was looking at. I will ask you only once. Is this letter authentic? The hands moved. She caught it, the right hand lifted from the table and touched, briefly, the edge of his lapel. The gesture she had been watching for since dinner the night before, the nervous inventory of a man checking his defenses. Then the hand went flat again, and Voss looked at the letter, and the quality of his silence changed. It is authentic, he said. But the context, who directed the arrangement? Harwell said. I was asked. He stopped. He looked at Price. He looked at the letter. He looked at Lord Harwell, who was looking at him with the neutrality of a man who has already formed a judgment and is waiting for the record to catch up. I was asked, Voss said again, and it came out differently this time, with a different weight in it. By Miss Renard. Directly, in January of last year. She told me the arrangement was known to the Duke and had his informal approval. I had no reason to. That is sufficient, Harwell said. Price had gone very still. The gentleness had not left his face. She gave him credit for that. It was remarkable control. But something had left his posture, some weight he had been carrying that he was now setting down. She watched him make the calculation, watched him reach the conclusion, and then she watched something else pass through his expression, not remorse exactly, but something adjacent to it, some flicker of a man who is older than his scheme and knows it. He did not speak again. Harwell did not require him to. We will need the full account files, Harwell said to Edmund. The originals, not the copies. I will have my own man examine them this week. They are prepared, Cecily said. She had had them prepared since Tuesday. The arrangements that followed were practical, which made them bearable. Harwell and Edmund sat with the papers for another 2 hours. Lady Farnsworth remained because she was a woman who understood when she was a witness and took the responsibility seriously. Agnes brought tea. Doyle stood at the window for a long time, and then, when there was a natural break in the proceedings, came to where Edmund was standing and said something quiet that Cecily did not hear, and Edmund's hand moved once, briefly, to Doyle's arm. Price was permitted to leave before the technical proceedings concluded. This was Edmund's decision, and he made it after Harwell had confirmed that what was required for the account recovery was the paper evidence, not a prosecution, and that a formal complaint to the county magistrate would create more disruption to the estate than the matter warranted. Price was dismissed from his position. He was given a reference that described him as diligent and thorough, with no further comment, and a quarter's wages. Cecily had been the one to suggest the reference, and she had done it with the specific knowledge that Edmund was watching her when she did it. Voss was handled in London by Harwell's own office with similar terms. The arrangement with Isabeau Renard dissolved before the month was out, quietly, in the way that such arrangements dissolve when their architecture is suddenly visible. She had her cold wing, after. That was what Edmund said to her. It was 3 days after quarter day, in the evening, and they were in the library again, which had become, without either of them deciding it, the room in the house where things of importance happened. He was at the window, which was also where things of importance happened, and the candles were lit because the evenings were coming earlier now, and she was at the desk, with the account books that were already, under the new steward's tenure, beginning to show a different character. There is a cold wing at Ardcourt, the north-facing rooms. She used them because of the headaches, as I told you. No one has used them since. They have a study with good light. She looked up from the account books. I tell you this, he said, without looking away from the window, not because I believe you want to be installed in a wing and left to the accounts, but because I want you to know the house is yours. All of it. In the sense that I should have made clear from the beginning and did not, because I am a man who has spent 3 years deciding that walls are the same thing as protection. He paused. They are not the same thing. She put down her pen. Edmund, she said, which was the first time she had used his name. He turned from the window, and the expression was fully legible now. She had her catalog entry, finally. And it was something she recognized because she had been wearing it herself for 11 months and had not known what it looked like from the outside. It looked like composure over considerable feeling. It looked like a person who has decided to say the true thing and does not know what will happen next. I am not asking you anything, he said, that has to do with the accounts or the estate or any obligation either of us arrived here carrying. I am asking something entirely separate, without any connection to anything that has happened or been settled. He crossed the room, not quickly, and stopped at the other side of the desk, and looked at her with those gray eyes that she had been reading and revising for 11 months. Whether there is any possibility, at any future point, however distant, that you might consider me differently than the evidence of this year has warranted. She stood up. She was shorter than him by nearly a foot, which had never been relevant before, and was now, somehow, important. Marry me again, she said. Choose it this time. Tell me plainly, with no entailment and no account attached, that you want to, and I will say yes or no on the same grounds. His expression moved through something she had never seen on his face before. Not the tracked first laugh as a plot event, because he did not laugh, but something lighter than anything that had been there before, as though a long carried weight had shifted to a place where it no longer chafed. I want to, he said. Plainly, then yes, she said. Plainly, he reached across the desk and set his hand over hers, where it rested on the closed account book. And she looked at his hand and then at his face and thought, this is what it costs, and it costs considerably less than the alternative, and the accounts are now honestly kept. Agnes wept at the wedding. She had firmly denied, in the 3 weeks preceding it, that she had any intention of doing anything of the sort, and she wept with a thoroughness that suggested she had been saving it for some time. The ceremony was at St. Cuthbert's on a Thursday in October, with 8 people in attendance, which was exactly 8 more than Cecily had required, and exactly the right number after all. Mr. Doyle stood with Edmund. Lady Farnsworth sat in the front pew with her usual air of a woman supervising a proceeding in which she has a considerable personal investment. Simeon Price found a position in the north of the country as a land agent for a smaller estate, and by all accounts performed his duties there with the same diligence that had characterized his early years at Ardcourt, which was either evidence of reform or evidence that the scale had been insufficient to tempt him before. Cecily thought the latter more likely, and said a small private prayer for his new employers, regardless. Clarence Voss retired on his own resources, which turned out to be more substantial than his salary warranted, and no one examined them closely, which was the arrangement that had been reached. The redeemable rival in this story was Doyle, who had carried Price's letter in good faith and had come to Cecily the morning after quarter day with an apology that was brief, direct, and without excuse, and had been received in the same spirit. He remained Edmund's closest friend, and became, over time, one of Cecily's most reliable allies. The charity school at Ardcourt was expanded in November, and the new physician's cottage was built in February, and the cold wing at Ardcourt was opened and aired and given a hearth and several excellent shelves, though Cecily did not retreat to it. She worked in the main library, at the desk that had become the desk where things of importance happened, and Edmund worked at the window, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they did not, and both were equally good. Her father had died before the wedding, he had been ill since spring, and she had known it, and she had gone to him in August and stayed for a fortnight and returned with something settled in her face that Agnes had seen and not commented on. The account he had kept, the small family sum he had managed poorly for 30 years, in the hope of making it sufficient for her, turned out to be sufficiently augmented by the Ardcourt estate recovery that it might discharge the debt it had always carried, the cottage her father had sold when she was 12 to cover a bad season, which was the cottage he had told her they would have again one day, in the voice of a man who does not quite believe the thing he is saying, but must say it anyway for her sake. She bought it in the spring. She did not say it was for him. She put it to practical use as housing for the Ardcourt schoolmistress, and in this way the account was settled without ceremony, which was how her father would have wanted it. It was August again when she understood that everything had inverted. She was walking to St. Cuthbert's, the same Sunday walk, the same August heat pressing the lane flat, and Edmund was beside her, walking, not riding, because she had mentioned once that she preferred to walk when the weather allowed and he had simply started walking, and she was wearing the Ashford blue with the silver heron at the collar, which she wore now because it was hers, because she had stopped treating it as a loan she might have to return. They came around the bend where the church first becomes visible through the limes, and she heard Agnes, just behind her left shoulder, conducting an amiable argument with herself about the proper order of the responses, which was Agnes's idea of preparing for the service, and she thought, 11 months ago, I walked into this church alone and stayed very still. And now I am walking into it with the full measure of what staying still was buying. She had not known then what the morning would cost her. She knows now what it cost, and it was everything, and it was worth every penny, and the accounts are honestly kept. Some stories have to pass through the middle of their worst moment before they can be truly over. The middle is never the end. It only looks that way from inside it, in the dark, when the proof is still in the boxes and the witnesses have not yet arrived. If this one found you in a middle of your own, if you have ever been the one everyone looked through, the one who kept their ledger carefully and waited for the moment the numbers finally told the truth out loud. Then I hope tonight you felt, for a little while, what it is like to be believed before witnesses. Come back when the fire is lit, there is a chair kept, and a candle, and one of us is always watching for you at the window. If you want more stories like this one, slow burning, dialogue sharp, and honest about what patience costs, stay close to the hearth here. A new story waits each week, and missing one always seems a shame. What would you have done when Cecily walked into that church and saw the crest? Leave me that answer in the comments. I read every one. Sleep well, and may your accounts always come out true.